Your workshops cover a lot of esoteric psychology, so I wondered if you could discuss that a little bit.
Okay, so I personally have studied modern psychology to begin with and modern philosophy. But then I discovered, when I was in my early 20s, I discovered esoteric psychology in the form of Ouspensky, Peter Damianovich Ouspensky, of course, In Search of the Miraculous, which you know about, and also Gurdjieff and his many works, which are really very, very important. And there are many elements to esoteric psychology, but we will just deal with a few of them today, probably will be pertinent. We have the item of subpersonalities, which esoteric psychology deals with in depth and explains to us why the whole subject of subpersonalities is very, very important. For instance, it explains that subpersonalities are evoked from us as human beings from external stimuli. So if you imagine a gentleman walking down the street and he's going to work, he has one subpersonality when he meets his staff in the morning, which is the subpersonality of the boss. Then during the day, he meets with various different business people for a luncheon, for a meeting, and he has another subpersonality that pops up to deal with these business people. And then when he retires home in the evening and he perhaps meets with his wife and his children, he's going to have another subpersonality that is going to manifest for his wife, and perhaps even a completely different set of subpersonalities for his children. And then maybe in the evening before he retires, he may have whiskey and a cigar, and he may watch a video or he may watch some TV, and another set of subpersonalities will be evoked and manifest. So this is just an example to show how subpersonalities are really very, very important. But the key thing is, Gurdjieff explains, is that we must go beyond these subpersonalities. We must live in essence. So in the previous video, we mentioned living in essence, or we talked about essence. And essence is really the core of the human being. It's the spark, the divine spark in each and every human being. And Jesus mentioned this in the Bible in the form of the mustard seed. And his parable of the mustard seed, he's really talking about essence. And it is mentioned by most of the great spiritual teachers in different formats, in different ways. But living in essence in the modern times is not easy, because everything in life is based on personality. Everything we see around us, education, our work environment, how we communicate, it's all based mostly on personality. But we can sometimes observe essence manifest in various ways. You may walk along the street one day and you see an old man look at a child, and you stop and you focus on the old man's energy and his gesture and his eyes, and you can see the love in the old man for that little child just for a few moments. And that is essence manifesting very strongly. And also you can see it at certain functions like weddings. This is a very powerful scene where often essence manifests very powerfully in the parents of the bride and the groom. Sometimes they weep. And really, this is not sorrow or anger or anything like that, but this is essence coming to the fore, because it's love for their offspring. It's a very powerful love. And love and essence are intimately connected. And then there are other instances when we see a man and a woman coming together who really truly love each other and really truly care about each other. And we see their manifestations and their gestures and their energy between each other. This again is a manifestation of essence. So essence is core, is pivotal, and it is really important for human beings. Personality is really the secretary. And when I use the word secretary, I'm not using that in any derogatory fashion towards people who work as a secretary. Not at all, quite the contrary. Personality is really the secretary in the makeup of a human being. The secretary reacts mechanically to things sometimes, does their job the way they're supposed to do it. The parameters are very limited. The scope is very limited in many respects simply because of the nature of what's happening. But essence is a very different kettle of fish, because essence doesn't respond in the same way as personality or any of the sub-personalities. Essence has got a strength, a veracity, and a cognitive ability that the personality or the sub-personalities do not possess. So if we live in essence, we are slower to criticize, slower to manifest anger, slower to agree to war, and really true essence does not agree with violence and is not interested in committing violence of any kind towards another human being. But then we take a slight jump and we go to the educated essence. This is really important because Gurdjieff explained that we have essence, but then we have the educated essence. And the way we educate essence is with esoteric wisdom. Esoteric wisdom creates a quantum leap in the essence of a human being. The essence begins to develop, mature, and manifest love, sensitivity, awareness, and tact towards other people, which perhaps was not there before. So when we're talking about esoteric psychology, we're talking about a level of psychology that is so different than ordinary psychology, so much more powerful, and gives one so many more insights into the human condition and our own condition, our own mistakes, our own frailties, and the elements that we need to change internally to make us more rounded human beings, more holistic, and more caring. Because really, all the great spiritual teachers, including Gurdjieff, explained that we should learn to enter into the position of our neighbor. This is one of the things that Gurdjieff said. We should learn to enter into the position of our neighbor with compassion and understanding, and not stand back and criticize carelessly without any foresight or foreknowledge of what our neighbor is going through and the conditions that our neighbor may find himself or herself in. We may have no understanding of this whatsoever, and this is what many people tend to do as human beings. They don't look into the situation deeply, but merely criticize from the sidelines. And it feels good to criticize others from the sidelines for the personality. But if we have essence developed, actually it doesn't feel good at all to criticize other people, even though it appears from the outside that those people are in the wrong, they've made mistakes, they were silly. Essence really holds back judgment before one knows the full picture about those human beings. So judgment is held back in reserve very often, unlike personality. Personality and the sub-personalities will criticize relentlessly and enjoy it. They will take pleasure. These sub-personalities will take pleasure from criticizing other people.
So esoteric psychology is really looking at yourself, but it's looking at yourself very deeply. So it's not really for the faint-hearted.
We begin in esoteric psychology by looking at others. This is much easier than looking at ourselves. And this gives us the platform to begin looking at ourselves, which is much more difficult. And in some instances, much more painful, because we carry a picture of ourselves, which is not accurate. And to get rid of this false picture of ourselves is actually a very difficult thing, because the mind, the personality, is very tricky. It tricks us into thinking that the picture we hold of ourselves is actually very accurate. But in fact, in the majority of cases, the picture we hold of ourselves is very, very inaccurate. Many of the qualities we ascribe to ourselves are not true, are not real, and many of our abilities are only partial to what we really think we have. So I think it's very important when we study esoteric psychology to look at personality and essence and begin to realize that certain of our manifestations come from personality, and probably a smaller number of manifestations and actions and reactions come from essence, where we are supposed to inhabit in ourselves. But I will say one further thing about personality and the sub-personalities is that we tend to react to outer circumstances. If you observe the average person on the street, their day is made up of continuous reactions to external events, external stimuli, what is happening in their environment, things they like, things they don't like. things they're attracted to, things they are repulsed by, but it's all reactions. And Gurdjieff explains that we have to find a place in ourselves, in essence, where we stop reacting. We slow down the whole process. We relax back into ourselves, in essence, and we stop reacting to outer events, newspapers, news bulletins, people we meet on the street, even friends. We have reactions for friends and various different kinds of people we meet. So we have to stand back and look at these reactions and see how real they are. In fact, most of these reactions are just learned reactions. We have them already inside and we just pull them out of the hat because they're convenient. And if we just are blank with our friends, it feels a little bit embarrassing. But actually, we need to practice sometimes being a little bit blank, not having answers for everything that we encounter in all people. This can actually be very helpful in understanding ourselves more deeply and other people.
During looking at yourself in the esoteric psychology and coming from Gurdjieff's work, he discusses the centres in man, which he says are very important to align, but it's quite a difficult task to do. Could you talk a little bit about the centres?
Okay, so the centres in man are, again, one of those pivotal items. We have 7 centres in all, 5 lower centres and 2 higher centres. And the 2 higher centres are completely functional in all human beings except those who are very, very ill. And those 2 higher centres function 100%, but are not connected to the 5 lower centres. But the really interesting thing about our chakras, our centres, is that they don't belong to the physical dimension. They actually belong to the psychic plane, which is a slightly different plane than our physical plane. But these chakras are anchored in our physical plane by the body. The body anchors the chakras or the centres in this physical plane. And this is a really interesting facet of the centres in man. And Gurdjieff explains certain key things about these centres. And one of the key things he explains is that when many people go to physicians and doctors and clinicians with problems, and they prescribe certain medicines, actually, it is often the case that some of these chakras, these centres, are either damaged or depleted. And we are actually being treated for maladies in the centres, not in the physical body itself. But quite often physicians take it to be the physical body. So our centres can be depleted, they can be injured, and actually, Gurdjieff says, sometimes a centre can die. When a centre dies, we see serious mental and emotional problems in a person. I happen to think myself that it's possible that the condition known as stroke may be the partial death or complete death of one centre. But that's just a theory of mine. But if we look very closely at the functioning of the centres and how they work, we can see that they are intimately connected with everything to do with the human being, the physical health, the emotional health, the spiritual health, the strength of that person morally, and the integrity of the person is really based on the centres. Because when we live life, we're inputting into the centres on a continuous basis. We're inputting energy through our experiences, through our moral stances, our moral code, our integrity, how we treat other people. This all impacts on the chakras. And Gurdjieff describes this process as egoplasticuri. So the egoplasticuri is the energy that we distill from life and imprint, if you like, in the chakras. And everybody is actually doing this on one level or another. But the aim of the esoteric path is to do this imprinting of the egoplasticuri on a high level, or at least to the highest level we can, on the level we find ourselves on. So yes, the centres in man is one of the core things we study when we look at esotericism and when we approach the esoteric path. All development in man takes place via the centres, the 2 higher centres which are fully functioning and the 5 lower centres which are not connected to these 2 higher centres. But one further point on this which is very important is that Gurdjieff explains that the 5 lower centres, although they're not connected to the 2 higher centres, the key element here is that in most modern people, the 5 lower centers do not function properly. They steal energy from each other. They don't function according to the natural parameters set by great nature. Gurdjieff mentioned this term very often, great nature. And what he's really referring to is the design and parameters set into these very special facets of the human being, the chakras, that modern people, our very way of life, our very way of doing things, items like modern education and how we live in personality, this restricts the functioning and integrity of the chakras. So they don't function up to scale to what was intended by great nature. And to give one example, we have each chakra is working with a different energy. And Gurdjieff measures these energies by delineating or calibrating them, calling them hydrogens. And he explains that our current emotional center functions with hydrogen 24. But actually, he explains to us that it should work with hydrogen 12. So if we work with hydrogen 12 in the emotional center, it is almost impossible to be violent to another human being. It's almost impossible to commit crime. It's almost impossible to be cruel. Because with hydrogen 12 in the emotional center, we begin to see so deeply into life that we're almost reaching that third stage of consciousness that he talks about, self-remembering. It's very close to this third state of consciousness, and there is a fourth state as well, but we'll just mention the third state for the moment, self-remembering. The Buddhists call this the witnessing consciousness. So we're on the verge of this third state of consciousness when we use hydrogen 12 in our emotional state. But the majority of humanity only use hydrogen 24, which is a much weaker energy, and therefore we see all of the emotions around us in people. This is a manifestation, really, of hydrogen 24. If people were working with hydrogen 12, we would see a much more profound manifestation of human beings. Actually, really, it will be a spiritual manifestation. It will be a deep concern and caring for each other, consideration of each other on a very deep level. But today, we have this on a superficial level. It's kind of a learned reaction from our education that we should behave in this way because it's socially acceptable, it's politically correct. But really, if we come from a deeper part of ourselves, it's not a learned manifestation. It's coming from our deepest core, our deepest spiritual core. We really care about other people. Why? Because we see in them ourselves.
And many people work or act like this, like a program, because, as you say, they've learnt it from others and they are concerned or frightened to be different. So that's why they stay in the program or doing the same as they've always done and repeat patterns. Yes,
I mean, this is where essence differs from personality so dramatically. Personality will do things in life because they see other people doing it. Essence is not programmed like that. You cannot program essence like that. Essence will look out on this scene of life totally differently, and it will not replicate things just because others are doing it. That is not how essence operates. Essence is actually a very different modality. It's a very different structure, and it's got a very different substance than personality. Personality is very shallow in many ways, but essence has got an integrity, a depth, a profundity to it, especially when it's educated, that personality doesn't even come close. It's like a very poor shadow of a developed essence. When you meet somebody with a developed essence, it is a pleasure to meet that person, because when they look at you, they're not weighing and measuring, judging you, sizing you up. They are looking at you with compassion. You are another human being who suffers on this planet, because the majority of people actually suffer, but none of us admit to suffering because it's a type of strange embarrassment that a human being should be suffering. After all, we are meant to be very high, elevated spiritual beings, but we suffer. All human beings suffer. Those who have not attained to a high spiritual level are suffering. So this is a very interesting facet connected with the centers in man.
And suffering, as you say, everybody suffers, but many people have tried to find ways to get away from suffering. or found other ways to do it, like we had the monk, the fakir and the yogi that you spoke of earlier. I wondered if you could perhaps talk about the ways, or the 4 ways.
Okay, so as you know, there are 4 ways, and Gurdjieff tells us that the 4th way is the esoteric path, the core teaching on the earth that existed before all the other paths. And then we have the 3 paths that come from this core teaching, as it were, the fakir, the monk, and the yogi. So he explains that these 3 ways are offshoots from this core teaching, and these 3 ways exist everywhere on the planet, can be found almost everywhere, especially with the fakir in India in various temples and courtyards, doing various physical practices. But the 4th way cannot be found openly on the planet. This is what Gurdjieff really tries to get across to us, that it is the core original teaching, but it cannot be found openly. One has to find it. And this is one of the thresholds, it's one of the tests for people interested in this very high level teaching. And one might ask, why is it considered such high level, the 4th way? And it's considered high level because in the beginning, much is demanded of us in many ways that is not demanded on the other 3 ways. And the other 3 ways, we are following a leader, and we are placing our faith very much in that leader and very much in that path without knowing too much ahead. But in the 4th way, everything is based on understanding. So we can only progress when our understanding increases. Whereas we may be on the way of the yogi, we're following blindly maybe another yogi teacher, but our understanding may not be in place for maybe a decade. It may take many years, and then our understanding may be very partial. So key thing with the 4th way is that it's on a higher level, first of all, than the other 3 ways. It's a much more difficult way in many respects, and it requires understanding of us at every step of the way. Understanding is vital. So we were working on our understanding. Understanding is the currency, if you like, in this 4th way.
Would you see it perhaps as a culmination of the 3 fakir, monk, yogi would develop into a 4th way?
Actually, from my understanding of this, it's completely the opposite. Is that, as far as I can remember from what Gurdjieff mentioned on this when he was asked questions, and also Ouspensky, they intimated that it was people who had left 4th way schools or who'd been asked to leave 4th way schools at various points in history because they were unsuitable or various other reasons, and they moved into society. And those individuals may have been centered in the intellect, or they may have been centered in the emotions, or they may have been physically centered people. So if, for instance, you had an emotionally centered person who'd been asked to leave a 4th way school, they would have moved into society, and some of them may have wanted to continue with knowledge and with inner development on a certain level. But because they are, for instance, with the emotionally centered person, they would more often than not start up a devotional methodology, a devotional path for people. And so they would develop monasteries and religions. And this is how the original core teaching sort of devolved into these 3 different paths, because with modern people, they're generally divided into 3 different categories: people who are intellectually oriented, people who are emotionally oriented, and very physical people. We can meet people in society who are very physically oriented. They're not interested in art, emotions, music, or anything like that. And they're not interested in academia. They're purely interested in physical things like doing boxing or martial arts, or just very simple physical things like farming. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with farming or martial arts or boxing, but some people are exclusively interested in these things, and these are what we would call physical people. And the physical person coming from an esoteric school would simply start some form of practice which is very physical, like the fakir in India that we find in the courtyards of many monasteries in India. So this is how the core teaching, the esoteric teaching, in ways devolved into these 3 ways. But these 3 ways, even if we put them together, does not give us the core teaching, does not give us the 4th way. This is like a misunderstanding. We cannot build these 3 together and get back to the core teaching, the esoteric path. We have to find this esoteric path and become part of it. And one little tip Gurdjieff did give on this, he said, if you can, become very important to the people on this path, and you will be given a lot of latitude, and you'll be given a lot of grace. So if you become important to that work, if you become an important element of what is happening within a school, or even groups connected to schools, you then will make maybe faster progress. He hinted at this.
If you'd like to find out more about Joseph Mckeaney and the core teaching, you can look him up on the website thecoreteaching.weebly.com.